Fomapan 400 is a black and white film with classic characteristics that remind me a little bit of Kodak Tri-X, but also a little bit of Ilford HP5. It is, however, much less expensive than either of those films, so for the last couple of months I've been shooting it with the intention of discovering whether or not I like this film, how much I like it, and whether or not I think it can replace either Tri-X or HP5 in my daily rotation. Basically to see whether or not this film cuts it as a do-everything, all-purpose film that I can simply keep in my camera as a default. This is a standard grain, black and white film, which, according to Foma, has a nominal sensitivity of 400 ISO. You can have this in any format that I can think of that you would use, at least conventionally. You've got 24 and 36 exposure cassettes, 120 medium format rolls, as well as a couple of different sizes of sheet film. This film also is available in bulk rolls in case you want to load your own cassettes, and there's also a really neat kit which features one reloadable cassette and several rolls of pre-cut film that's already the correct length for 35mm 36 exposure rolls. It's just not loaded into a canister that can be used in the camera. You do that yourself. Both the bulk roll and the load it yourself kit are much less expensive, making this a very economical choice. If you intend to shoot quite a lot of it, that's maybe one way to go. One quick note, the 35mm version has a very thin anti-halation layer on the film base, which I'm going to get into a little bit later. One standout technical feature that Foma brags about, at least in their technical manual and random places on their website, is this film's exposure latitude. This film is rated at 400 ISO by the manufacturer. However, according to they themselves, you can underexpose this film by up to 2 stops or overexpose it by up to 1 stop without needing to adjust the development and still expect to get comparable results at various speeds, which is a very nice feature, but I'm going to get into how well that works a little bit later in the video. Finally, this film is usually available for between $5 and $7 a roll, and as I mentioned, if you choose to go for a bulk option, it's even less expensive. Over the last 6 to 8 months, I've exposed a number of rolls of Fomapan 400 to test it out to see how much I like it. To do this, I used my Nikon FM combined with a variety of different lenses ranging from 35 to 200 millimeters. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the 35mm version, and some of the critique points that I'm going to mention are, at least as far as I can tell, unique to the 35mm variant. This is the variant that I have experience with, so it's going to be the only one I comment on in this video. To have the film developed, I decided to send it off to the darkroom lab, and when I got the email containing the scans from the initial rolls of film, I was somewhat disappointed with the results. All of the scans were flat, and the images were a bit muddy and dull and uninteresting looking. And it didn't matter how much I edited the scans that came back once I downloaded them and loaded them onto my computer, I wasn't really able to bring images out of the film that I liked. My initial thought was that this was maybe a lab issue, but it really wasn't an inspiring start for this film stock. When the negatives arrived for the first 2 rolls of film, I decided to completely rescan them from the ground up myself to see whether or not this was more of an issue with the film, the way that the images looked, or if it was an issue with how the lab tech had scanned them. And scanning the film was a bit tricky. First off, this film doesn't like to lay particularly flat. Unlike films from Kodak, and especially films from Ilford, which lay extremely flat, this was a little bit more tricky to get a nice, proper, sharp scan all the way across the negative and to get it to lay flat properly in my flatbed scanner. It wasn't so much that they curled along the length of the film strip, but it actually curled along the width of the film, which was much more difficult to deal with. However, after a bit of work and a bit of fiddling around with scanner settings and with editing the images a little bit in Lightroom, using Negative Lab Pro to do the conversions rather than Epson Scan software, I was able to get images that I was satisfied with. I just had to work a significant amount harder to get them off of this film than I had in the past. Before I start dissecting the image quality of this film, I just want to take a moment to preface this by saying everything that I'm going to say in this video is based entirely on my own personal experiences. I'm trying to be as neutral and as factual as absolutely possible, and to more or less give you a basic look into what you might want to expect from this film if you decide to give it a try yourself. Of course, the best way to decide whether or not you like this film is to try it yourself. My goal with this video is to simply give you a jumping off point that might get you excited about trying this film, and you can go from there and do with the information contained herein as you see fit. Sharpness isn't quite up to par with this film stock. It trails a little bit behind Ilford HP5 and quite significantly behind Kodak Tri-X when it comes to just creating really sharp detail throughout the image. However, one area where I find that Fomapan really surpasses both of those films is in grain handling. At least for me personally, for a 400 ISO film, this delivers very pleasing grain. The grain is quite nicely defined, just like with Tri-X, unlike Ilford HP5, which tends to be a little bit clumpier than I like, but it's not quite as intense as some other film stocks that I've tried. It really hits a sweet spot of being present in the image, very nicely defined, without being unobtrusive. However, if you were going for a completely grainless look or a very low grain look, definitely avoid this film. This is a higher grain film stock than some other films, especially T-grain films, but that should be a given considering it's a classical grain film, and the emulsion recipe itself is, at least as far as I can tell, one of the older ones that's still on sale today. This film does also have a fairly decent dynamic range and a pleasant tonality. The highlights and the shadows can get a little bit useless pretty quickly as they just start to sort of roll off into nothingness. The shadows in particular can get quite muddy and gross, and the highlights can start to become somewhat blocked up fairly quickly. However, if you simply keep that in mind when you're exposing and adjust your enlargement or your scan accordingly, you can still get very good images with plenty of detail throughout the tonal range, so long as you take your time to make sure you know what you're doing. In my experience, in terms of contrast, this is a film that likes contrast. It really favors high contrast scenes. At least the images that I took in high contrast environments were the ones that I liked the most coming off of the roll. Coming to the advertised exposure latitude, or this film's ability to handle over and under exposure. According to Fomapan, you can get up to 2 stops under and 1 stop over without needing to adjust your development and still expect comparable results compared to shooting it at 400. Basically, you have a 200, 400, 800, and 1600 ISO film baked into one roll. Now, with that in mind, I wouldn't say that the images are indistinguishable. They are very good. Underexposed by 2 stops, this film holds up impressively well. However, be prepared to lose quite a bit of shadow detail when underexposing by that much. This film does very well underexposed, but I would not say that it does so well that I would treat it as a multi-ISO film. I don't think there really is such a thing, and that aiming to expose it as well as possible for the 400 ISO, although I actually found it performs a little better, pushed slightly towards 320, similar to Kodak Tri-X, interestingly, but that could just be anecdotal. I think so long as you set your film to 400 and try as much as possible to get this as on par with your exposure as possible, you're going to get really good results. If you slip off a little bit and have to, for one reason or another, underexpose by a little bit in order to avoid camera shake, for example, or you don't have a lens that opens wide enough in a dim environment, you'll be okay, and you'll get images, and they will most likely look fairly good. In terms of overexposure, it doesn't behave in any way better than any other black and white negative film that I've ever tried. That is to say, you can handle overexposure quite well on this film, but again, trying to nail it in the middle is the best route to go. One area where this film performs particularly well, I think, is with skin tones. The slightly thinner anti-halation layer, which can cause some haloing depending on whether or not you have strong, bright objects in your frame or they're backlit, actually tends to improve the look of skin. It lends it a bit of a nice glow that I personally find very pleasing in my photography. If I'm honest, from a purely technical perspective, it does not hold up to the much more expensive films like Kodak Tri-X and Ilford HP5, but I feel like that's to be expected. For most day-to-day use cases, this film does as well as any other that you could possibly think of. And I think in most instances, the differences between this film and the more expensive films in terms of technical capability aren't so dramatic that you would even really notice them, unless you were taking two photographs of the same scene at the same time with both films and then comparing them side by side to see which one, retained more information, which part of the tonal range better, or had more pleasing grain or whatever. I don't think that most people do that, and I think that's not really relevant. Going into this 6 months ago, when I first bought my first rolls of film, I was thinking of trying to find a replacement to the more expensive Tri-X or HP5 films that I really, really enjoy shooting, but cost so much money. But having tested the film now, I don't think that comparison is particularly fair or useful. Fomapan 400 is its own film, and it is as different from Tri-X as Tri-X is from HP5 and the other way around. This is a film that holds up very, very well on its own. It has lovely, nostalgic, classic qualities, a handful of flaws that are, I'd say, well within the realm of something to be expected, especially at this price point, and it performs quite amicably for most everyday situations. I would certainly say that this is a decent bread and butter film stock. If you want to buy a whole pile of one film stock that you can use in basically any situation that can hold up to varying lighting and can respond at least to some degree to push and pull processing without completely breaking up and doesn't break the bank, it's going to be hard to find something better than Fomapan 400. A possible alternative would be Kentmere 400, which is a film I intend on reviewing. I'm actually working on reviewing at the moment and have loaded into a camera and have been shooting quite a bit of for the last, I'd say about 6 to 8 weeks. So review on that coming in the future.